topics and the subject.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is, as you have done for some of our more seasoned commissioners, you've done for a few years, and for our two new commissioners, we kick off our budget session each year with doing a projections report, as well as identifying those focus areas that we're going to kind of drill down to as part of our overall budget process. So this is really the first of your budget work sessions. Jeff promises he will not go 4 hours like he did last year. With that, I will turn it over to Jeff Yates to kind of give you an overview as to what we see the trends are doing, where we are kind of financially at the 10,000 foot level, and respond to any questions that you may have. Jeff?
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about our projections report. Everyone should have received a copy of it. For everybody watching at home, we're going to post it on our website. It should be up there by the time this meeting's over. As Cindy mentioned, we're going to try to keep it to an hour and a half. That's the plan, at least.
That's the plan.
But feel free to interrupt me, ask questions. If there's something that's not particularly clear, I know we have two new commissioners that haven't been through this process. Commissioner Simpson has had the pleasure of this being his third. Commissioner Jerry Simpson. So to get used to that. What we're going to talk about today is I want to review the 5-year projections, talk about the findings, discuss our staff recommendation for budget focus areas, and receive direction concerning those. And the way that this kind of shakes out, or the way that the 5-year projections are developed, is it's really a multi-pronged approach. We're going to go over the general overview, which I'll talk about in just a second, and kind of why this is important, and answer the who cares question, because I always had this professor in college, particularly in public policy school, whenever we write a paper, you get to the end and write the big question, who cares, at the end, because this is all meaningful in some way, and I want to help you understand why it's meaningful, help people understand at home why it's meaningful. So I want to talk about why it's important. We're going to talk about financial projections. We're going to talk about the fiscal indicators, economic and debt indicators, a process we use called our demand for service indicators, the specific findings of the report, and then again our budget focus area recommendations.
Jeff, you may want to tell everybody where we're at in the book.
Okay, no, very last tab. I'm sorry. Very last tab in your book should be the presentation. And we're on, I think we're probably 3 or 4 deep now in the presentation. So, F3. Is it F3? Okay, perfect. When we start talking about our 5-year projections, what a lot of places do, or what a lot of localities do, is they really focus on what they would call their financial projections, which you can see, that's that part. And I kind of see this as a multi-pronged approach, or a comprehensive approach to long-term planning. Because what we're talking about today, as Cindy mentioned, we're at the 10,000 foot level. And really why it's important is it kind of gives you a sense, as the policymakers and the directors, as kind of the folks crafting your budget, what's going on in our community. What things are changing the community in which we serve and the services we provide. So when we kind of look at it, the reason we do this first is this sets the frame for the full budget discussion. Because what it does for us is it helps us identify then areas we should focus on, areas of concern, kind of some idea of directionally which way we're going as far as services and financial projections. It kind of gives us this big indicator or general indication of what we think is going to happen in the next year. And the best way to describe this is not about necessarily individual components, but looking at it like a giant roadmap. And if you think about it like this, if we wanted to drive to Los Angeles from Union County, we'd sit down and we'd plan our trip out on the map. If we take a slight deviation to the right or to the left, we're going to either end up in Canada or Mexico. And a very slight turn at this point would do that, right? So just like that is, if we're looking at our projections document, we can make slight corrections now to take us in a completely different direction, versus if we waited until we were right up against that decision point, we can make drastic changes, but still not change our eventual destination. Does that kind of make sense for everybody? So as we kind of go through this, kind of keep that in mind. We're not really focused in necessarily on the detail or the specific indicators we're looking at, but kind of take a step back from it and say, what is this telling me overall about the county? Because then that's the basis for our process going forward. And like I said, that's the projection report is made up then of the financial, our economic and debt indicators, demand indicators, and fiscal indicators. I apologize for everybody at home because I know this is extremely hard to see. That's why it's always good to have the presentation document. This is our projection report. Okay, this is where we spend a lot of our time modeling the general fund. And as we kind of go through our budget process, we continually tweak this model based on our decisions or based on the things we talk about as we go through it. And I'll kind of just point out a few things as we look at this. As pointed out earlier, or as pointed out to me, there's a big discrepancy going from ad valorem taxes in FY 2014, which is an actual number, to our revised budget for 2015. And if you remember back in our budget process, we had a bifurcated budget process, meaning we split the school's discussion out into its own tax rate and its own fund, if you will. So this is the general fund. So what you see in 2014 in the 165,000, you can look down here. A portion of that, 82,000, is under the current expense without current expense funding in the following years. That's where we split the schools out into their own fund. And I'll talk about schools a little bit in just a few minutes. But that's why you see that precipitous drop from 165 to 76 and so forth. A couple of other things generally about the projections. The way we do it is we take a snapshot and look backwards up to 10 years. Evaluate the trend that's been going on in each individual line item. Our projection's done on a line item basis, not on a categorical basis. So things like health insurance, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, are projected at different growth rates than, say, office supplies. So we don't just apply a universal growth factor. Things we're not sure about are things that have kind of a weird trend. A lot of times we'll use a 2% inflationary number as a proxy for growth into the future. This actually benefits from having the correct personnel, mostly correct personnel numbers from our budget development given our current staffing levels and so forth. So we feel it's a pretty good starting place in the model. And I want to point out a couple of features of this particular worksheet. The way to read this, sources obviously all of our revenue and uses. So these are categorical expenditures. We've broken out UCPS current expense, volunteer fire departments, and EMS, and UCPS related debt service. Those typically aren't broken out, but because we want to talk about them a little bit more, I broke them out just for illustrative purposes. So when you get all the way down, revenues are shown as a negative, positives are, expenditures are shown as a positive, and if you're wondering, interdepartmental charges are chargebacks which reduce expense but aren't revenues. When we get down to the bottom, when this number is a positive number, okay, that's a draw on fund balance, or expenditures over revenues. For instance, if you look here, you can see revenues over expenditures, that would have been a contribution to fund balance. All right. Down across the bottom, I didn't put the general fund reserve on here because we're about 1.3 away from our policy level. So I just put the over-under. So in any year this is negative, means that you are under your policy level for your reserves, which if you remember is 20%, the schools fund and general fund expenditures. And then we get down to our over-under percentage and our variance to sensitivity. And those are kind of the key things. Remember we talked about that 10,000 foot level and kind of keeping a big picture look at it. This is really where I'd encourage you to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking through this aspect of it. When we look at general fund revenue and expenditures, you can see 2014, and our expenditures are going to outpace revenues just ever so slightly. And what we've determined is if we spend some time analyzing the revenue trends and expenditure trends and where the county comes in against what it budgets every year, what we've discovered is that we could have up to a 3% variance, again, budget to actual. Because if you remember we're doing budget estimations right now for next year at this time and months following that. So in some cases, we're up to a year, 14 months, 15 months out from the months we're trying to project. So what we try to do is kind of quantify that variance and say, it's not being exactly right is impossible. So how close should we be? And if we are a little bit off, what does that mean? So what we've determined is that over time, if we can keep the out years meaning everything past 2016 in a 3% plus or minus, then we're close enough. We're within our variance, or what I would call our tolerance for variance. So if we're outside of that, for instance, if we're looking at this right now, we're a percent and a half over. So we need to do some work. And I would be remiss, because I was reminded earlier, I needed to point this out. This is for discussion purposes. This isn't the proposed budget. No parts of this is a recommendation at this point. This is just kind of a projection based on the information you know. As we go through, and as Cindy and I work with departments, we will work to get this, let's see, 2016, we'll get that number to 0, because when you're dealing with the budget year, the budget always has to be balanced. And if you were to look at this, and you probably see it better on this slide, actually, if you were to look at this deficit number or this reserve policy number, that's built cumulatively. So you just keep adding the numbers across. So if we correct 2016, it goes to 0. So the next year's deficit then becomes, that number becomes the 7 million number. Does that make sense for everybody? And then we continue to reduce these variance numbers over that time period. Okay.
And if I might, Jeff, all of this work that Jeff does is prior to the department submitting their budgets. So their deadline was just last Friday. So just now to finance, we have received all the budget requests. We really spend usually 2 or 3 weeks in March sitting down with the departments and going through their requests and fine-tuning them. So this is just based upon a snapshot in time, and then Jeff making projections as it relates to what we think some of the increases will be based upon CPI, et cetera.
And if you look, for instance, when we talk about revenues, see we have intergovernmental revenues, and they're roughly the same. That's our state and federal revenues, and for the purposes of our projections, because they're kind of waffling and back and forth at this point, we kind of hold those flat, because it's a conservative approach. So when we look at this number, and everybody always kind of gets a little concerned about that $6 million number down here at the bottom, that 5.9, that's well within our ability probably to close that gap at this point. Now we'll get, when we open up and we start looking at departmental requests, that number may jump till 8, 9 million out of the gate. But then we'll whittle it back because we have more revenue to add in, and we have more refined cost estimates to add in, including capital programming and those different kinds of things. So we really try to, this first snapshot we give you is an all else being equal approach, that if we didn't do anything, this is kind of where you'd end up, knowing that we're going to do a lot of things in the intervening months. So going back to our tax base, tax revenues are about 69% of the general fund. And the question always comes up of why we kind of split out ad valorem for schools versus kind of using all of our other resources. Well, you would see that our local option sales tax is about 31 million as it grows out. And our ad valorem taxes I think in this year about 176 million. So that is about 69% of our total revenue. So there's not a lot of other revenue when you consider then too that we have unrestricted, restricted revenue available to give for resources. In addition, ad valorem tax of all these revenues is the only tax that you get to set the rate on. The sales tax rate is set separately. The intergovernmental revenues and all those other things are going to have very specific strings attached to them. So the way that we handle for right now in our projections, you can see right here in our ad valorem there's a slight growth. We kept the property tax revenue flat, and I built in a slight increase for automobiles. And the reason we do that is in the calculation for the revenue neutral tax rate, the county is allowed to benefit some from new growth. If we were to keep that number completely flat, then that would only exacerbate that deficit we're looking at. So if we do the way the revenue neutral tax rate calculation works, is we calculate the revenue neutral tax rate and then new growth comes on top of it. So that there is a little bit of growth in that revenue. So we think that by keeping it relatively flat, we've taken a more conservative approach, but at the end of the day, assuming you adopt a revenue neutral tax rate, there will be a little bit of additional revenue that comes out of the ad valorem taxes in this case. With our first numbers, fairly conservative on sales tax. They're about 3 to 4% growth out of the future. I think the one I saw Friday, they're talking about 12% year-over-year growth in the state. I'm not going to suggest we start at 12% growing out into the future. That's a little more aggressive than I would like to be, but you can see kind of how that works out in the other taxes. So you see at the end of the day, our biggest chunk really then becomes that ad valorem tax and what we do with that. This is going to be critical because at the end we'll talk a little bit about the revenue neutral tax and wanting to have a workshop on that. But really where you go with that tax rate is going to determine what level of service we're going to be able to provide, because it is the bulk of the funding you have in the general fund. So looking at employee costs, or looking at costs in general, one of the big drivers that we have in the county is our employee costs. Excuse me, I still have a nagging cough I can't get rid of. And when we take the schools out of the picture and you start looking at the costs that you have in the general fund, what quickly surfaces is you see a large chunk becomes committed to employee benefits. And this has always been a little bit hidden behind the schools number because the schools was such a large part and represented such a large part of the contract number and contractual services, or not contractual services, sorry, in the contributions to the governments in that area, that it kind of reduced the percentage. So you would see this number would normally be, for instance, we were looking at it here, it's always been around 20, 22, 23, 24%. But when we backed out or bifurcated the schools piece out of the equation, what we saw was probably something more accustomed to what you would normally see in government. I think typically it's right around 50, 55%. I don't know what your experience is, but in the governments I've been with and reviewed, it's always around that 50, sometimes even up to 60% of your total cost. Well, what we see over time is that compensation is growing and then employee benefits. And the reason you see compensation growing is in our projections, two things are going on. We have the second and third year of the implementation of the sheriff's new pay plan for his deputies. Plus we have an assumed growth of compensation of 3%. And when we look back, what we find is, whether it be through the merit pay program or additional staff members, that we can count on employee compensation to grow by about 3% annually. So whether you give pay raises or we add those new people, that growth is going to be there. So we go ahead and put that into the equation at about 3%. And then, like I said, you have that additional cost for the next 2 years. So you see a little bit higher growth in these 2 years than what you see following, because you have the second and third year of the sheriff's pay plan with his deputies. Employee benefits, we're anticipating about a little over 6.5%, and that's a blended rate. We're thinking about 8% on health insurance and health inflation. We also have retiree costs. We have pension, OPEB, those other costs. So when you blend all those different growth rates together, it comes out to about 6.5%. But what you would see then is over time, because that's growing, and most everything else is still growing in that 2.5% range, that it starts to eat up a bigger chunk of your budget, even going all the way out to almost 45% by 2021. And what becomes important then, and as Mark looks at our health insurance program and our benefits package and our other post-employment benefits, is any changes we make as we go through that process help to reduce that cost and even help to reduce that long-term liability into the future. So we're constantly working on trying to reduce the employee benefits portion of this to ensure that we're getting the best value. Okay? Does that make sense?
Can I word it a little bit differently? Because if someone's watching, they could interpret that a different way. For example, last year when we did the projections, I think we used 10% for health insurance. When we went through the budget development process and started looking at what our claims history was, what our reserves were, etc., we were actually able to reduce that in the budget document down to 3%. So we usually start with a fairly expanded number and then hone it down as we spend more time with it.
and keeping in mind, the county is self-insured. So we're not necessarily at the whims of the insurance marketplace as much as we're at the whims of the medical marketplace. So as medical inflation and the cost to go visit a doctor actually climbs, that's where we see our cost growth. Whereas a lot, if you have insured, fully insured companies, where they see their growth is as the marketplace tightens on the insurer side, then they see their costs go up because those insurers are also reacting to the medical marketplace and its inflation in that way. But Cindy's exactly right. We work on that number and we start a little high, knowing that we may have a little bit of room to lower that a little bit later, but I also don't want to shoot it too low because I don't want to have to come back and start adding. I like to cut during our budget process. I don't like to add back. Capital funding, one of the biggest drivers we've had in the past and continue to have is our debt service and our pay-go funding. And a lot of times you'll hear me refer to this as our capital effort, which means how much are we paying outright for capital projects and how much are we paying for the debt service on the capital projects. The good news is we've kind of peaked out as far as debt's concerned. So if you were looking at the light blue bars in this table, you can see them start to decline over time. That's basically because in North Carolina, the way we structure our debt is highest first few years and then a declining debt service after that. So we're finally hitting the point where we're benefiting from the the last construction in 2009, 2010 timeframe. For all that debt now we're starting to see a serious decline. In addition, all the refundings and the swap terminations and those different things we've done are starting to add, and we're starting to see that savings appear and materialize. In addition, you see we have the dark teal almost pay-go. In 2014, you had a large chunk, particularly when it came to schools, schools capital funding and the emergency money for roofing and those things. That's kind of where that was at. And you see in 2015, you have about 11 million. That's SPCC. That's the $7 million for the Human Services Building, and then a couple $1 million for the Sheriff's Firing Range and those things. And then you see in 2016 what we have is the last piece of the Sheriff's Firing Range funding, and then some ongoing funding going out in the future. So you can see it kind of levels out. If you were actually to look at that cost, you would see that it gets down, we can see right here, it gets down to about 500,000, a little less than 500,000 into the future. And what we've done is programmed ongoing funding for community services facilities, meaning parks, libraries, to just replace carpet, HVAC, paint. This is all cash, so it's not debt. So that they have funds to go to without us having to go up and down each year, that they can build, if they need a boiler or something to that effect, they can build some funding over a couple of years to buy that if they really need to get to that. That's managed by facilities in conjunction with those departments. And we've done the same thing for other county facilities. We put funding in for ongoing facility maintenance and repair. Because as the facilities get tired, we're going to want to replace things that aren't necessarily things you want to debt fund, that don't really require large capital projects, but require the ongoing funding from that perspective. In addition, you see that the debt service is declining, and then kind of doesn't decline near as much, but then continues down. What we've done is also programmed in the funding, debt funding, a 5-year note for tax assessment software for John Petoskey's office. This is something that's been in our capital plan for a couple of years, and we kind of keep bringing it forward. He didn't want to replace that software ahead of the reval, but as soon as he's done with that, he's going to want to go and replace that. I think his system is probably 8 to 10 years old at this point, and it's multiple systems versus one system. So for efficiency and to ensure the accuracy of our billing and our next round of assessments and so forth, he's going to want to go ahead with that replacement. In addition, we've also programmed in about $1.8 million for voter machines. We have an unfunded state mandate to replace the voting machines. We haven't been told if the state's going to fund them, if we're going to fund them, or how that's going to occur. So we have them programmed out into the future. So those two are really the big pieces that impact debt service on our side from new projects. But really, it's in the pay-go, and also in there we have some sand replacement, some IT network projects that need to be done for the county as a whole. So what's really then driving our costs? Because we know we've seen our employee cost, and I would be remiss in not pointing this out. one of the reasons why we can continue to operate and continue to do the things we do as an organization and even grow some of our expenditures and do our employee compensation is because we're getting the advantage of this declining debt service over time. As revenue grows ever so slightly, we're able to use this savings, which at the time when the debt was brought on, no tax rates were increased to cover that debt, but 88 positions were cut out of the organization. So that money, that savings that's coming back is being put back to the county as a whole to offset the growth in those funds. So when you look at it in total, across the total general fund, we're growing right around that 2.25% number, 2%, 2.25%. But that's because we can do other things because of our debt service savings and some efficiencies. So I want to be sure I point that out because sometimes I forget to answer the question of how are we able to do all these things and still keep our budget relatively in line. So what are our big key drivers really coming up in 2016? Well, I think keeping in mind our employee benefits and employee costs and those things, and working those down, and Cindy and I and department heads will work together to try to get the internal workings of our budget within our tax rate. These are your other big drivers, and these are external to the organization and are right on the edge of the control of staff as far as building our budget. And the first one's really the Ems Funding. And as you can see, it went from 4.3 in 2014. This year it's almost 5.3, and next year it's projected almost to be right around 7.8. And the reason that is because talking with EMS, they put a signal to us that they're going to ask for additional vehicles and additional staffing. The additional staff is about 1.34 million, and the additional trucks are right around 1.2, depending upon how many they get. So again, this isn't a recommendation or based on a contract negotiation or anything else. This is a projection based on what they've told us to date. In fact, we reiterated with them on Friday in a conference call with their finance folks, and this is what they told us, repeated to us again. So as you can see, we kind of have that big jump this year, and in theory, that funding would get them then to the performance levels outlined in the contract. And in fact, I think it's on tonight's agenda to approve, for Cindy to approve that once we get some of these other performance issues ironed out. But then you see it kind of drops down just a little bit, then settles into more of an ongoing, what I'd call an inflationary growth. And because we know we need to get them up to a certain level to start, but then after that, they should level off and not continue to grow at such a rapid pace. So that early on in these first couple of years, this was getting them to a certain level. Now, if you were to draw this backwards and we had 13, 12, and 11, and 10 up there, you would see that number right around $3 million. And that's because during the lean economic times, just like everybody, the county held EMS flat, and they weren't allowed to replace equipment. So they have a little bit of a pent-up equipment demand that they're trying to meet. And that was part of that growth going from 14 to 15. And also going from 24-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts was the big cost driver there. The other area that kind of is concerning to us as we kind of look at this, and the key driver that we see, is this jump in VFD funding. And this is, just to be clear, this is the subsidy the county gives that's above the fire fee, above the sales tax, and above any taxes that they collect. So this is an outright payment made from the general fund to these various fire departments. Okay, and this is typically, and I believe all of your fee-supported departments, none of your tax-supported departments. So that is 13 different departments. And you see, and again, if we were to see 13, 10, 11, and 12 going back up there, they'd be in that $300,000 range. But the same issue is they have not been replacing equipment. And on top of that, what we're seeing then is as their costs are growing, as the firefighter standards are changing, they're needing additional equipment, additional staffing levels. They're having challenges collecting volunteers. So we're seeing these costs come in full-time staff, or part-time staff, or call-out pay, or different forms of compensation, and in new equipment that they need. For instance, the air pack standard changed over the last couple of years, And most of these stations are having to replace all of their air packs. And those are $2,600 to $3,000 a piece, depending upon which one you get. So what we're seeing is then this jump, $1 million jump from 14 to 15, and this is primarily to address that that pent-up capital demand, as well as to fund some staffing. And then I projected about a $500,000 increase in each of the next couple of years. And then again, just like with EMS, I would anticipate that VFDs will settle into some kind of inflationary growth once we get on the cycle of equipment purchase. Because one thing differing probably from the EMS funding for the VFDs is once we buy a fire truck for a station, those stations we don't buy a fire truck for the same station every year. So we'll be able to take the funds from the previous year that are built into the base, or built into this number that we've already kind of projected, and buy a truck somewhere else without having to raise the amount of funding that we've been giving to the VFDs. So that's the benefit of the county funding, just outright cash for a truck versus a debt payment or something to that effect, is we can move that around, and over time, over a 10, 15-year period, then we will cover a significant chunk of the VFD, of the volunteer fire departments, and been able to replace quite a few trucks that way. So you can see your biggest jump then, we had about a 1.9, almost $2 million growth from 14 to 15. So your biggest jump for looking at next year, or about half of that $6 million deficit we saw at the very beginning, is really tied to the additional funding projected for EMS and for the VFDs. Question, you have a question?
Question. The fire trucks, do we own the fire trucks that we buy for them?
No, sir.
Or okay.
We do not own the
That is
fire
a
trucks.
contribution to that 501c.
Yes. It's we fund the cash and they go buy the truck. And some of that has to do with, obviously I don't think we want to own fire trucks and be responsible for maintaining them. But the individual fire departments have differing needs on what types of trucks and those and the different kinds they need. So if you're in the western part of the county, you may need something that's for more confined space or have a ladder on it, versus if you're in the eastern part of the county, you may need a brush truck. Not that they don't do them in the west, but it just depends on where your VFD is.
Now, we did own one truck, I can't remember which district it was in, but I think we corrected either the last year or the year before, and we donated it to them.
Okay.
So
You had one.
that we would no longer have that kind of strange relationship.
So explain to me again, why we're going $3.5 million up from 14 to 16 on the EMS funding?
And going from, well, let's take it in two steps, okay? Going from 14 to 15 was primarily the shift from 24-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts. So they had to hire additional staffing. And 2 new units, not new units, 2 replacement units, which are the trucks. And then we also had in here built a couple $100,000 for software, not First Watch. Marvelous, which they're not going to do.
Not gonna do.
So if I could bleed over for 2 seconds in the EMS discussion, the $160,000 needed to do the IT upgrades for the EMS contract. We talked to them Friday about having them do those out of that money versus those 2 software systems they're not going to buy. And the other one was a road maintenance program, and I can't remember the name of it.
I can't either.
But it amounted to about $170,000 or something total. So because of that software they're not purchasing, they should have funding within this year's budget, within that 5.2.
There was almost $1 million in funding for that software, 800 and some. But Jeff and I had a difference of opinion on this funding because January 30th, they were supposed to be converted to the 12-hour shifts.
And they have.
And they finished that.
Yep.
So the funding for those people are there. 2 additional trucks will require staffing, and they're working toward that. I think it's going to be far less than that from my understanding of being on the committee. So I think that's a no.
Well, I've heard that before, so I'm a little concerned to set it up here.
Well, I agree. I was too when I saw it as well.
So Commissioner, continue answering your question. If you go from 15 to 16, what that amounts to is 6 new trucks, 4 replacement, 2 brand new units to get to the 14 and 11 staffing level. or for deployment level, and about 1.3 million to cover all the additional EMT and paramedics that go on those trucks. Because it takes 8.
They have, I think it's 8, then they had, trying to remember, 2 overhires per shift.
It takes 10 to 12 people to run out a unit, because they're not 8 to 5. They're 12-hour shifts, and they have to have those 12-hour shifts covered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So as they buy it, for instance, a new truck and then staff that up, it takes 8 to 10 people to put on that truck to deploy that unit out there. So that's kind of how we came up with our costs, and our conversations with CMC during this process is that the personnel piece is going to be a little over $1.3 million, and then the new trucks at $200,000 a piece, they may need up to 6 new trucks. Now we're hoping to drive that number down, in fairness, but in this case, what I wanted to be sure we do is kind of show you the worst case, so that I don't come back and say we had to add 2 more trucks and we didn't realize it. So this is based on our conversation. Now we're going to try to find another way to pay for those 2 trucks they're talking about needing. But at this point, it's included in that $7.8 million number.
And were those 2 trucks not initially discussed?
Can I answer that?
You absolutely can.
I don't care who answers it.
When we went through the plan, they've got 11 and 9 right now. They go into 14 and 11. So you need 3 additional trucks.
Okay.
The 2 trucks they're buying this year were to take them to 13. And they were instructed in the committee that they take one out of the reserve fleet because they had 7 reserve trucks.
Okay.
Now, the additional 6, that's new news to me because we didn't discuss that. But I do realize that any fleet is going to have replacements ongoing.
Sure.
But we didn't get it. We had a list of ones that needed to be replaced in the committee, and it had 2 replacements, 2 QRVs. No ALS units were identified as needing to be replaced. Now, next year that might change. I would see that in our budget process for next year, if they document that they need to replace an additional vehicle, then that should be brought to the table. But to assume that you've got to have 6 trucks, I think will inflate it. And it wasn't discussed.
Well, keep it in
And I don't know
mind.
that it was discussed in the working group. This, I think Jeff got his information when we had our negotiation session a week ago, Friday,
Okay.
was when they started bringing up the number in order to meet the staffing requirements that were contained within the amendment that we are in negotiations with, that they were going to need additional units and additional personnel in order to meet the response times, et cetera, that they have committed to meeting by January 1st of 2016.
But when we had the working group, they didn't have any trouble making those commitments.
I was not there, so I can't speak to that.
And what, commitments for what?
Well, all of a sudden, we've got all these additional expenses.
And these numbers
We
were,
just went through this whole,
actually, at the end of this year, we're gonna have the equipment we need to run what ongoing, not to grow anymore, is the intent. I think the difference is if it was brought to your attention that they want additional replacement units, those were not identified in the committee's discussions. And if you'll take these 2 additional, that takes them to 20 vehicles, and 20 to 14 meets your 140%.
okay.
So, that's why I say I think these numbers are inflated.
And you're saying they're inflated based on, they're not gonna need that staffing, they're not gonna need
Well,
those trucks?
the staffing, they should have the staffing to complete their staffing by January 1st, this coming January. But they will
January
have,
of 16,
January 16th.
okay.
But they will have the equipment necessary by July. Because they've already ordered
July
2,
15?
15.
Okay,
And they will have purchased those now,
okay.
okay? And that purchase has been negotiated out of, I think it was out of fund balance you talked about using it this time, out of their fund balance.
Part of it was out of fund
Out
balance.
of their fund balance.
Out
So,
of BMS's fund balance.
That's true. And like you said, the 160,000, that is for the IT equipment that's going on the trucks, and just a little bit of IT equipment to go in the comm center to bypass. Right now, we have to go through their firewall, and that's creating problems to go through with HIPAA regulations and everything. So they're gonna carry 2 laptops in every ambulance, every ALS, and one will come directly to our comm center. So, you know, that, Jeff will tell you, he and I had this conversation earlier today.
Well, and in fairness, what we've asked CMC to do is if they need the 2 additional units above the 2 replacement units that they've already purchased, or they've already ordered, is to use fund balance, because we believe they have sufficient fund balance to cover that. So if we do that, and this discussion occurred Friday afternoon, so I didn't change the projections report to reflect that. If we do that, then that shaves about 400,000 off that number initially.
Because
So we go from 3.5 to
their
3.
head count is not going to increase. Right now, when you plan an ALS unit, you're looking at what, 500,000 to 600,000, because the additional equipment and the head count going along with it. Any additional equipment that comes in next is actually a replacement, and it may be you just put a new frame under a box. You may order the whole ambulance, depending on the situation.
Right. So as we kind of work through this, the goal was to try to get it in where we knew we weren't shorting it. So hopefully we can get this down with CMC. And the other point I have to make is their budget's due on the 15th of February, and then we'll have a real snapshot of what their request is for next year. This is based on conversations and kind of based on the question. So I wouldn't ever suggest this is the number that we have to have, or this is a recommendation, or this is a starting place for negotiation. This is just kind of, if you take everything they've said to date and put it down and pencil it out, this is kind of where you end up. Now that changes every couple of weeks. We have further conversations. There are certain things that come up and change. Just like the commissioner said, we have negotiated to some degree for them to spend fund balance to buy those 2 units. So that would reduce that requirement here by, like I said, about $400,000. Okay.
And there's other things like franchising other, ambulance services we talked about, and then even some potential maybe to merge these 2 with some of the VFD funding. I understand that from listening to the working group, and not on them, but before that, the hearing, that there was some opportunities for some firefighters that could actually be drivers and work with the paramedics. So there's a lot of different money saving opportunities here that if we just work and try to find them, we can do that.
Well, I think the question that's going to come out now once we get to the contract, and Jeff, flag me if I get to a point where I should be talking about this, is we have our deployment locations that the EMS committee kind of laid out. So these are all the VFDs we want to deploy at. We've also, through the VFD funding, paid for some of those VFDs to have daytime staff and staffing so they can run medical calls. Because if you look at most VFDs, somewhere between 60 to 80% of their calls are for medical runs, not for fire. So the question then becomes, if we have staffed and stationed at the VFD an EMS unit, should we, or do we have to pay also for a volunteer firefighter or a daytime paramedic to be at that same station to run medical calls, which we should be dispatching our EMS unit to? And I don't know the answer, and I'm obviously not the fire guy or the EMS guy, but I think that that's a discussion we have to have, because in our conversations with the VFDs and their need to start adding staff units to ensure that they have staffing for those medical runs, particularly during the day. But when you put 14 units out there, mostly in VFDs, you change that dynamic, because particularly in the east side of the county where they're having trouble with those daytime volunteers, you stationed units in those locations. So I think once we kind of finalize where our deployment stations will be and kind of those sites, then we have to come back around to the VFD conversation, and how does then that affect the VFD funding and how we handle the VFDs.
I thought we had already finalized where our spots were going to be.
We have.
You have?
It's in the contract.
Okay. And so the contract's been signed then?
No, tonight,
We're still in, I would say we're still in negotiations. There's still a couple of issues that were identified in your agenda abstract that
Well, you'll have to forgive me, I haven't had a whole.
I know you haven't, and that was not intended to
No, I
be
understand.
disparaging
No,
at all.
No, I understand it.
But there are a couple of issues that we are still discussing with them that I was gonna bring up at the meeting tonight.
So we're gonna discuss that later. Okay, well, I'm not gonna take any more time here.
Okay, let's get you in the neighborhood.
Yep.
So, real quick snapshot of the debt. How does our debt break out? You can see, following our rapid growth, the largest chunk of our debt comes from our school system. The general county debt primarily is made up of SPCC facilities, the core facility, and the Ag Center. And again, we can see that kind of trailing off over time. And if you were to carry that all the way out to about 2030, 2031, you would see it completely eliminated. Okay, so talking about our reserve levels. This table is normally in your monthly report. And what this does is kind of gives you an ongoing snapshot or ongoing accounting of where we are in our fund balance and our reserve levels. So if you were to take, you could see if you were to start with our $80 million, that in general fund balance, the non-spendable portion, meaning that's accounts receivable or it's some kind of asset that's not liquid, prepaids, those kinds of things. Restricted fund balance, which means there's some external force to the organization, bond covenants, federal government, state government, contracts, restricting those funds. And then you get down to committed fund balance and assigned, and those are commitments and assignments made by you as a commission, whether through policy or through appropriation, meaning for projects and those kinds of things. So your fund balance policy, that 20% number, is split out. If you remember, we had to come back, two of you won't because you weren't on the commission, but right after the budget, because of the way we changed our budget document and changed our fund structure, we had to do a cleanup that identified the reserve level as coming from both the schools fund and the general fund. And when we did that change, because we did it after the end of the fiscal year, it changed the level of commitment. So the portion that is in the schools, that accounts for the schools fund, shows up in assigned, and the portion from the general fund shows up in the committed. Next year, that'll correct itself, but it happened to be a timing issue with the auditors this year, so they made us show it this way. So we get down all the way down to the balance. You have about $1.3 million above your 20% policy level that can be used for any lawful purpose based on what the commission decides. So let's talk about school funding for a little bit, because obviously the presentation should be no fun unless we get school funding.
But can I back up?
Absolutely.
This additional 1.3 is a result of the tax increase?
That additional 1.3 is the cumulative impact of revenues over expenditures over your reserve level and appropriations that you've already made. So that is just like retained earnings would be in a business. Once you, if you were to close the books and you want to keep your reserve level, that 1.3 would just be kind of above and beyond everything else.
All right.
Does that make sense? Okay. So one of the big discussions we had during the process last year is how does the school funding and breaking it out into a separate fund, and then later in the process the state legislation impact the school funding. And if you remember kind of going back, what the legislation said was that the current expense funding, which is this line right here, will grow at the growth in ADM and inflation. And then that the capital funding, which is that line right there, will grow from 19.5, which was the number that we used in one of our presentations, to 19.7, which is again a number we used in one of our presentations. So what we find when we kind of break this analysis down are a couple of things. So if you're looking back, if you go all the way back to the very front, you see the $165 million ad valorem, and you're wondering then next year where the rest of it went. Well, here's the rest of it. So This is the ad valorem tax that has been historically shown in the general fund is now shown in the schools fund. We break it out into auto, and that's real property. So it's about $108 million. And if you remember kind of going back, we set the rate as a smoothed rate. So you wouldn't have to essentially raise that rate in the second year to be able to fund the second year of the school's funding. So we get down here to the bottom, and you have a contribution to the school's budgetary fund balance of that $1.7 million. And the intent is then for that $1.7 million is to kind of work to offset the next year without having to raise the tax rate to cover that. And based on our projection, that will actually work for next year if you use the revenue neutral tax rate. And you can see we kept ad valorem tax flat, slight growth in auto again. And we come to that because based on our estimation of ADM growth, and this is kind of how it works. And I wanted to put this detail. This detail is not in the book, but I wanted to kind of show you how I arrived at these numbers. How we get to the 2.4% growth in ADM is if you take the final ADM for 2014, and this is per their financial statements, and you add you take the 20-day ADM, this is from their 20-day report from September, their growth is 2.4%. So we plug that number up here to represent ADM growth. And then if you were to go to the BLS, what you'd find is December over December growth, which is our latest number we have, for nationwide, because the legislation didn't specify a regional CPI, but it specified the national CPI for all items included. That CPI growth was about 0.8%. Okay, so then we add those together. The growth that they should receive based on this calculation for current expense is about 3.2%. So you see that number carries out. That's how we get from 87 million to 89 million for projected funding for current expense next year. And then in the future, we just, I plugged typical, what I would consider a pretty average CPI of about 2%. And I said, okay, if their growth, I think the McKibben report said actually a little less than 2%. So we would just use a round number of 2% growing out. So that 4% into the future. And then you can see, again, we already know what the legislation said as far as capital funding, but then what we've assumed is that that legislation becomes the funding process into the future for this purpose. So that projection that we've included here says we're going to continue the legislation out in perpetuity on that basis. Not recommending that, not saying that's how we have to do it, it's just so you can see what the cost impact is. And then you can see that the capital funding grows out over time. Really, it's the growth in ad valorem, because the capital funding is represented more by a tax rate than it is represented growing by an inflationary number or anything else. Okay. A couple of interesting things to note about this. Coming back to the sensitivity to variance number, the variance is pretty low in that first year. So based on us having this fund balance and the ability to kind of offset those numbers, we feel pretty good that in 2016, we shouldn't have an issue if you use the revenue neutral tax rate. We should be right there. Okay, so our plan worked, essentially is what I'm saying. The thought that we were going to fund it early and then reduce the second year down so it's a smooth rate worked like we expected it to, or we anticipated it to. But then you kind of jump to that 3% number. And one thing, I wouldn't say, I don't know what their sensitivity is year over year. I know what ours is. So in theory, they're 3%, if you will, out of whack compared to their funding in this case. And then that number just kind of grows out over time, as you'd expect it to. And I really think, the kind of the key is, and Commissioner Simpson pointed out to me earlier, that this is kind of the, if I wanted to walk away with one thing to kind of keep in mind, when we're talking about the general fund and our sensitivity and our ability to close that gap, those aren't structural problems. What we're saying is we can manage our way through those needs for reduction. When we see a problem like we are seeing here, where we're expecting growth in the 4% range, but the ad valorem tax growth is about 1.2%, that is a fundamental structural imbalance in your funding structure. Okay? Because 2% or 1.2% doesn't grow as fast as 4%. So when you're looking at your school's funding, and as it grows over time, we're kind of in a conundrum, because after we get past next year where we have that planned smooth year, and we're blessed because student population growth didn't achieve as high level as we thought it might, and inflation isn't as high as we thought it might be. So we're kind of benefiting from those two. It's gonna be a tough spot, because what you're gonna be looking at is, if you were to continue this funding model on capital and current expense funding, then this tax rate is not sustainable to do that.
Do those ad valorem values reflect the revaluation?
No, and that's kind of one of the areas. What this does, you can see I kept the revenue flat because we know we're going to have a decline, and I promised John Petoskey I wouldn't even venture a guess as to what that decline will be. But we're going to have a decline in value, so to catch revenue, to keep revenue equal, your real rate's going to have to go up to keep that revenue side equal. So for the purposes of projections, we kept it level on the real property. Now there will be some impact for the reval calculation and how you calculate new, but it's not going to be, I don't see it being $20 million or anything like that. Because in that case, I'd imagine you'll want us to kind of more neutralize the rate than anything else.
But it will be several million.
It may or may not be.
We really
John's-
don't have good, I met with John just a week ago, and they don't believe they're far enough in the process to even give us a good guess, and we'll have, my guess is by March, isn't that what he's told you? We should have a fairly good number.
Jumping ahead to the very end,
Okay.
one of our discussions we're going to have is reval. We had originally slated it for the end of February, 1st of March. We flipped it, and now it's the first meeting. Our plan is to have that work session first meeting in April. John, we'll get our first look at it in the next couple of weeks. But he's got what he calls in the box, which is the stuff that he knew about. Now they're going through discoveries and kind of going through this whole process of all the new stuff that they're out there getting. So for our purposes, because the tax rate's going to inch up, the question will be, how much revenue do you want to take out of the tax rate, and where do you want to level that tax rate? Because when we talk average impact to a household, we're talking average household, and no one in Union County is average. So some folks are going to see a decline in their value on their tax bill, but their tax bill may go up a little bit. Or vice versa, they'll see some value grow and their tax bill go down. It just depends on the individual case. So what we're going to try to do is, on a global scale, calculate what a revenue neutral, meaning we're not getting any more money out of the process than what we're legally supposed to get in that calculation, while keeping that tax rate to where it's supposed to be for the taxpayer, trying to neutralize that impact. Does that kind of make sense from that perspective? So when we do it for this purpose, just to kind of keep it as apples to apples as possible, I keep that property tax piece level from year to year. And if we were to gain a little bit on this, it would just improve this year. See, because we have this, if we still have balance down here, that's a positive. That's a good thing. So I'm not suggesting that as we start the budget discussions with the schools, we say, you know what, here's this and here's an extra $1 million to go with it because we just happen to have it sitting there. I think you have to do it in the context of a long-term plan.
But if the revaluation the impact was zero, you're still looking in future years with the deficit.
Right.
And stop me again, or correct the number if I'm wrong. Last year we talked about a $9 million savings that you achieved through county side of this, or was it total?
When we looked at, there were two pieces last year. We were talking about our fund balance, and we kind of eliminated our fund balance usage. It was $12 million of efficiencies through the organization, meaning that through debt savings and some attrition and those different things, we were able to save that money. But we also had
was that the school and the county combined?
no, that's just the county side.
So
That's in that 3% number we talked about.
So we saved $12 million just on by saving the money. You did a good job. And so-
Last year we did, and that's not going to be every year.
Right.
And we don't want to start banking on that. But
if you did half that, it'd be $6 million.
But we don't want to start. We need to budget and allow departments to budget what they think they need. We get that through a whole bunch. The general fund's made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of expenditures. So it could be $2,000 here, $1,500 there, and all of those then add up over time. And the big thing we had last year is we had an overhang on the motor vehicle tax collection process. So we collected 16 months of motor vehicle tax, which amounted to about $6 to $7 million more revenue we weren't supposed to budget for from the state. So if you take that out of the equation, we were only about $2.5 million over on revenue. The bulk of that came through our efficiencies.
So that
$3
was,
million of which
that
came
was,
through
that
debt.
was in above, the savings were 12 million.
Right.
The new revenue was 6, 8, 7 million.
Above, if you take into account the motor vehicle tax plus the sales tax, it was probably right around.
I guess,
$9 million.
and the point I'm getting to is that if we could save 6 to 12 million, you know, the schools could probably do the same, and then we could, you know, always look at needs or special stuff after that, maybe to, be nice that if both organizations were working that hard to save the money.
Sure. Well, and I think that if you look back, for instance, in 2014, if you were to evaluate the schools, CAFR, in a lot of discussion around the $85 million, the $86 million, they ended up spending about $79 million in their general fund. So they do see some of the same savings we do. They treat them a little differently, and they have a little different approach to long-term planning than we do. So what we try to do is we give you a plan like this that says, you know, let's set a tax rate at a level where we can burn this down over a couple of years versus taking it all in 1 year, because that's a sustainable approach. Not to say that they don't exercise sustainable approaches to different things. I'm not familiar with how they would do it on their side. But that's kind of as we go through, and when we started talking about, for instance, on tax rate last year, that was kind of the approach that said, okay, if we take a 2-3 year look at this, how are we able to mitigate any spikes or ebb and flow in the tax rate? And that's why we set the tax rate where we did, so that we would generate a balance, knowing we'd burn it down. And if you kind of have an idea, this is the same approach, and I saw it sneak in the back, same approach you use on your water rates. Because the water rates in any given year don't necessarily fully fund or exactly fund that year, but they provide you enough money over time to do your capital program and your operations such that you have a level funding structure. Otherwise, you could be raising rates 8%, 3%, 9%, 2%, but you really try to level that out so that it's maybe 5% over 3 years versus a jagged or just-in-time rate model. And we kind of take that same approach when we're working on the tax rate. Does that kind of answer the question? Probably a little more than you wanted to know. So, but again, like I said, this is really represents a structural imbalance if you're going to continue this funding structure. So what does all this tell us? Some conclusions. The general fund deficits are not really structural in nature, so we feel like that on the general fund side of the house, we can manage with what we have here, and I think Cindy's made the commitment pretty much to try to move forward with keeping ourselves within that revenue neutral tax rate. I don't think it's realistic to keep us at last year's tax rate just because of the loss in value and the hit that takes out the gate, but we'll keep it within the revenue neutral version of that for the proposed budget, unless you give us other direction. Moderate growth is expected, both revenue and expenditures. What we're not seeing is a huge period of growth or a huge period of decline on either side. What we're seeing is just kind of steady growth over time. And I have more statistical look at that to kind of show you why we think that. VFDs and EMS funding are kind of be our big drivers. Employee costs are going to continue to grow. Debt service is a plus for us. We're seeing that decline. And then the UCPS funding is going to be a challenge going into the future. And it really amounts to that, like I said, the difference between general fund and the schools fund is ours are not structural in nature. The schools funding is really a structural problem, which will have to be addressed. Okay, so kind of moving on now from the fiscal indicators. Any other questions about our non-fiscal indicators from the projections piece? I think I'm okay on time.
No, I just checked.
We do this package of indicators called our fiscal indicators, and what these are ICMA put this together a number of years ago, and this ICMA is the
International City County Managers Association.
Exactly. And these are comparative statistics you can use. They come out of the CAFR, your financial statements, to compare yourself or to give yourself a sense of how your organization is doing. And what these do is take, for instance, operating revenue per capita. Most of these, and you can read more about it in the report, most of these are now adjusted into into constant dollars. So you can really see the real change over time. And if you're familiar with how inflation works, over time the value of a dollar changes. So when we say we adjust them into constant dollars, it allows us to compare 2008 to today and actually see what the real change was, not impacted by the inflation number. Okay, so that's what all these have been adjusted. I believe all these have been adjusted for inflation. And you see different indicators. For instance, operating revenue per capita. Well, in 2008, we were getting about $467. Now we're at $427.69. So what this does is says if you adjust for inflation and you adjust for population growth, we're on a per capita basis collecting less revenue than we were in 2008. So we put the trend negative because you can see it kind of spiked up in 2012. And the big reason that was, and if Andrea is watching, she'll be happy I mentioned this because she always points this out to me, is when we got the hospital lease revenue, it caused our revenue per capita, that one-time payment we received, to jump in that single year and it dropped back down. So if you take that number out, you can see a trend starting in 2009, we got hit a peak year, and you start to see a trail off down to where we are today. Property tax revenues in constant dollars. So we've seen a little bit, we saw a growth in 2008. I'm guessing that's probably your reval went from, your increase from 08 to 09. And then we've held about steady on a constant dollar basis. And so I'm not going to go through all of these. There's an in-depth discussion in the report about every one of these indicators. But when you take them as their total and you look at this, when you see more green than red or orange, we're doing good. The red, you should look into a little bit more. So for instance, operating revenue is a negative trend, and our only other negative trend is public assistance recipients per 1,000 of population. And that's concerning. And we were seeing some improvement, but then we saw it kind of bounce back up. And there's a couple of reasons why that would be, but I'll save that for the demand index.
Just real quick, I mean, what is that? I mean, you would think with an improving economy, you would have a better.
You would think, but there have been some changes at the federal level that have caused more clients to come in than we would have thought. Because you're right. Intuitively, what you would think is that as the economy improves, you would have lesser need for those services. But because of the specifically because of the changes in Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Health Care Act, we're seeing a lot more clients come in now, and the roles are changing. Did I encapsulate that correctly?
Yes, that is, we are very much seeing more people for Medicaid right now.
And I have a little bit of discussion when we get to demand on that. So, see the local unemployment rate. This is a very positive trend. While 08 was kind of everybody considers the peak right before the fall for the economic downturn. You know, we see ourselves at 11% in 09, and we're at 620, and I believe we're even lower than that now. I think we're right around that 5% number.
44 is the last one I saw in it.
Okay, so we're doing better. And then for those folks that are interested, this is always an interesting one. Gross retail sales, again, in thousands and then constant dollars. So we're seeing economic growth in the county. So really, what do we find from this? I put to kind of not spend too much time on the indicators because these, as fascinating as I think these are, these may not be as fascinating for everyone else. Revenue growth is fragile. I think what this tells us is we can look across here in a revenue per capita, but see gross sales, when you kind of combine those two things together, you see this kind of fledgling economic recovery. It's not the strong bounce that you would expect to see. A strong bounce would be both operating revenue going up, property tax revenue seeing a strong rebound, and retail sales going up with employment going down, unemployment going down. That's what I would consider to be a strong recovery. So I still think we're kind of in a not as strong a recovery as we'd like to think we are some days. So expenditure growth has been well managed. I think that to have survived through this period and still be able to provide the services, particularly when you talk about declining staff and some of those other things that you see when you start looking at the demand ratios, I think we've managed our way through the recession fairly well from a service perspective and provision of service. Benefit cost indicators are negative. As we start to see the total cost of an employee, it's continuing to grow, and then our fiscal health is strong overall, because as you can see, we have obviously more green than red and orange. It's pretty much that simple from this perspective. So, any questions on the fiscal indicator before we move on from there? And again, I encourage you to kind of take them as a whole package when you're trying to think how this impacts us, because while individually they're kind of interesting in the trends that they represent, they kind of give you an overall, if you will, thermometer to your organization. This is new this year. For those of you who had the pleasure to sit through this last couple of years, remember we used to use a triangle, not a diamond. The triangle then was the fiscal indicators, the demand indicators, and the financial projection. Based on our discussions with our bond rating agencies, we decided we wanted to add a package of indicators to our report that represent the local economy, kind of things external to Union County, plus where we are on a debt basis. Because what we found is the users of these reports, and believe it or not, other folks come on and pick these reports up and read them, they're curious and interested in these things. So when we put this information out, it allows then the readers, both our residents and bondholders and all those folks out in the world, get a better understanding. So in working with my staff and our FA and all of our group, we've come up with an additional group of indicators. And I'm happy to say, and I'd like to say first and foremost, we created the indicators before we did the data. So the fact they're all green but one doesn't mean we went out and selected indicators that were positive and then put them in the report. So, but we picked some things that we think represent not only the health of the county, which are these kind of bottom 5 here, but these 3 up above kind of give you an idea how the region sits from an economic perspective. Again, CPI talking about, in this case, the South and its inflation number. The Case-Shiller Index is an idea or a snapshot of housing market. Consumer Sentiment Index. And this is always interesting to me. This index actually goes back, I believe it's 1964 is year 100. And the way an index works is you snapshot 1 year and that's your base, and then everything is off that base year. This kind of tells you how, kind of going back, how do people see the local economy, and should I be buying stuff? Do I want to buy a house? Do I want to buy a car? Do I want to go buy that new washer dryer? Do I want to go buy a handgun and take a concealed carry class? Disposable income. Do I have, or do I feel good about my income situation, my employment, to the point where I'm willing to go out and spend more? So when you see increases in consumer sentiment and feelings of positive toward the economy, what you see is more activity in the local economy. And that local economy then translates into additional tax dollars and additional local sales dollars. So knowing that this is based off then of the 1964 number, and we had an interesting long conversation in our office about this, is that people are actually 21% less hopeful today than they were in 1964 about the economy. While it's improving, if you can think about it this way, in 2008, people were 33% less hopeful about the local economy and how they saw themselves in the economy and how they were going to go forward and their willingness to spend money. It's just a side trip, but I always think that's kind of interesting from that perspective.
Quick point, gun sales go up when that happens. It's the reverse.
That's probably true.
It is.
Quick ratio is a measure of the county's liquidity and ability to make its liability payments out of its existing cash. And the leverage ratio is another way to look at that, saying how the total assets compare against long-term liabilities. And you see the difference of the disparity between these two because under the general statutes, when we build a school, we have to title and give that school over to the school system. But all the debt stays on our books. So the best way to think about it, you build a house, you go get a mortgage for it, you give the keys and the title to somebody else, you keep the mortgage note for yourself. And so that's why that leverage number, we see our quick ratio going up, which is positive. Again, the same blip in cash from the year where we see the one-time funding. But this leverage ratio is not as high, is because you're seeing that impact of that long-term debt without the asset.
And why do we have to do that? Why can't we keep it at our?
It's based on general statute. That's what the state in its wisdom decided. General Assembly in its wisdom decided that's how we should do it. unless that school facility is securing debt. So we saw a couple of schools that are used for certificates of participation, which are actually securing the debt so that if we don't make the debt payment, they'll repossess the school. Not that it ever happens. But the rest of the general obligation debt, for instance, when you build a school, you have to give it to them. One positive, which all of these are positive except for CPI, which I'm always concerned about. The debt service, two things I'll point out that's always interested in the bond market, because we're going to be talking about a bond election possibly. Debt service burden, meaning how much of our revenue goes to debt service. You see that's declining, and this is 2014's number, so it should be less than again in 2015. And then debt per capita. This is a measure of the individual burden, and you can see in 2008 we were at $3,200, almost $3,300. Now we're down to right around $2,000, and that should again trickle off a little bit more in 2015. So overall, I think this is good. This tells us what we want to see. This is positive when we go to the bond market. The bond market will appreciate this aspect of it. But keep it in mind, inflation kind of tends to be a looming concern, particularly when you start talking about the things government does and the things we build, and streets, pipes. We don't build streets, but buildings, those kinds of things. So demand for service index. I'll be mindful of my time. What we have done here is we kind of revamped the index for 2016. One of the challenges you have in government service is really determining what is the changing demand for the services we provide. How do we know when our residents need more other than people just showing up? So kind of the concept with the consumer price index is they call it a basket of goods. So they have someone go out and survey, for instance, walk into a supermarket, write down the cost of a loaf of bread, write down the cost of milk, butter, these different things that an average household would buy. Then they go and put that in a big database and they say over the last 20 years that price of bread has changed by X, the price of milk has changed by Y. That percentage change, when you put them all together, becomes the price of inflation. And so when we sat down, we said, okay, if you took a resident, what would be the basket of goods that a resident may encounter without having to survey or having to test or having to analyze every service the county provides? And this is our 11 pieces, our 11 data points we decided that are our basket of goods for determining our demand for services in local government. Library visits, ADM at schools, social services clients, health department clients, water and sewer accounts, billed daily water consumption, EMS calls, transports, building permits, sheriff's calls, and population. And new this year, last year we did all of these and just did them in a raw data form. But in that format, what we found was that library visits, for instance, were treated the same as an EMS call. Well, from a resource perspective, a library visit doesn't draw near as many resources as an EMS call or a student at a school. So we tiered the services into 3 tiers. You see on here per capita, which is the lowest impact group. We have a per 10,000 population, which is the highest impact group, and then we have that mid-range impact of 1,000 population. So when you adjusted those, they become what we believe is a fairly accurate snapshot of their weight or impact on resources within the government. And so as you look across this, I'll just point out a couple of things. For instance, this recognizes that a student is the highest draw we can have on county resources in this structure. Our building permit represents, or is a proxy for the highest draw we can have. And we generally adjust these to a per capita number so that they just don't grow with inflation, so we can see the real change in the demand, less inflation, or less population growth, I'm sorry, not inflation, but population growth. And then we come back to the bottom and say, okay, because we took population out across the top, let's add it back in, because while we recognize that the population has an impact, it's not a one-for-one impact above on all the services. So we added it back in across here. So you can see we have, for instance, a 16% growth in population from 2008. And if you were to look at average daily membership, the index number is 95.29. And that would say then if you're adjusting for population growth, if the county didn't grow at all, we have 5% less students coming in. So pretty much what's driving then the growth in the student population is the influx or increase in our population. And we know from our McKibben report, that's not due to births. Okay, so that's an influx of people. And you kind of see that same impact as you look across. You can see, for instance, building permit numbers. We're just now getting back to where we were in 2008. You can see there's a little bit of demand, and just as like you would expect, as we were talking about earlier, Commissioner Rushing, during an economic downturn, you would expect to see the highest amount of demand for government services, and then you would expect to see that trail off. But we saw this weird little spike, and that's kind of, we'll talk about that in just a second. But the way to interpret this whole table, and then again, there's a detailed discussion of every one of these indicators in the book, and I won't go through all of them. If you look across here, demand units, we're providing about 4.4% more service than what we provided in 2008 based on this demand index. Now you can see that kind of jumped here in 2010 to about 5%, then kind of tailed off and then creeped its way back up. The reason this is useful is then if we take our FTEs, which are our headcount, and we say, okay, we know how much demand we have and how much service units we're providing, or what we refer to as demand units we're providing. How's that then compare to the staffing we have? Well, if you did the same exercise and you said in 2008's 100 to today, or to 2014, we have about 5% less staff than what we had. So we're delivering 104% or 4% more, almost 5% more service with 5% less staff. So you put those together and you kind of do this, we do this demand units per FTE index is 110%. And the reason that we do this is what it demonstrates to us is what level of stress or what level are we putting on our employees. And there's two ways to move that production frontier, that efficiency curve out. You can become more efficient in your delivery of service, which allows us to provide more units at the same cost or with the same staffing, or you could also be stressing beyond a reasonable level, your staff, and it depends on the area. I think it's kind of a mix of both. I think in a lot of areas we've become more efficient, so we provide better service, we provide more service for the same cost through technology, through process improvement, those things. But I also think you have some areas that are particularly of high concern. And when you look at social service client visits, we kind of see just like what we would expect during the economic downturn. You kind of saw this arc of service, and this is per 1,000 population index. But more importantly, when you start looking at client visits per FTE, and a client visit represents all the touches. It's not, for instance, them going out to someone's house and visiting, but it's touches from the social service department. You can see that we put a heavy burden where we start here with client visits per FTE around probably 230, 240. By the peak, we were over 300 of those client visits or those touches per FTE in that department. And we spiked, and if you went back and you looked, this is about the same time we started having a lot of our troubles in social services. So we've kind of, over the last couple of years, worked toward adding staff and making improvements in that area, and we've seen this drop down, and I think you've also seen as that client visits per FTE have dropped, you've seen an improvement in the quality of the service and the quality of what's gone on over in social services.
I go back to that slide where you're showing the dramatic increase in 2014. So you're hiring more employees to fix the other problem. But this here, we have the demand for the demands increased greatly in 2014. That's demand for services mainly in social services, or?
This would be, that's the demand units, whoop, did the wrong button, sorry. This would be the demand per FTE. So if you follow this right across here, we drop down to 102. Now we actually, we dropped down, a part of that drop is we contracted out some positions.
Right.
But we've also rearranged the deck chairs, if you will, to shift people around and to keep that net increase to the county minimized as much as possible. So on a total FTE basis, we were down. And then when you measure that against, specifically against this department, what has happened is a couple of things. Our client visits have started to tail off a little bit, but also we've added personnel and staff in that department, so their client visits per FTE in this individual snapshot has improved as an indicator.
Well, something very interesting is with Obamacare, with the requirement of getting insurance, families, even with pretty substantial incomes, are, people who are not insured are being asked to put their children on Medicaid, I believe. So you may see even a bigger increase this year now that the penalties have come on. Richard, you see any of that? Have you seen an increase?
We have been slammed the last several months. Yeah, and it's been a complication of things too because of the whole NC Fast piece. So we have a lot of people coming in. We have people waiting 3 hours to be seen. And so
And you see people that you normally don't see?
we have a lot of new clients because of the requirement.
When you go on the Obamacare, see, we don't have health care. We pay for our own. We had to get it because of the mandate. We were paying our own and doing it that way. Even with what I consider to be okay income, they were pushing us to put our children on Medicaid.
Well, and if you look at in E8 of your report under the tab marked Demand for Services, you can see the public assistance recipients by type for social services. And we were trailing down on our public recipients, which we saw on the other slide. But what you see is there's a huge growth in the Medicaid clients. And if you,
Where's that?
it's on page E8. If you go under the tab marked Demand for Services,
That page is a table
you see it.
on the left-hand side.
So if you're looking at the table that's in the far left-hand or lower left-hand corner, there you go. So if you're looking at the table in the lower left-hand corner, and I apologize for those folks at home, I probably should put this slide in. The composition of the clients served as social service public assistance recipients has really shifted. We started to see, you see this tailing off a little bit, but then starting in 2013 and then into 14, you see the middle bar, the Medicaid clients, is starting to grow disproportionately to the remainder of the group. So, Commissioner Rushing, that's what you're talking
So
about.
that was last year. Now this year, when the penalties kick in, and next year when the penalties kick in.
Well,
The only reason we even did it was because of the penalties.
Sure.
I mean, imagine next year when the penalties go to double, we could see a huge number increase there.
And I think we're going to see that, and I think that the trend indicates that. And I think you'll hear quite a bit about that during the budget process and the challenges we're having with computer systems and NC Fast and the whole 9 yards. So, but it's a very good observation and a very good point that the composition of the social services, our public assistance recipients, is changed in such a way that the bulk are becoming the Medicaid recipients.
Are we getting any money from the federal government that offset that?
We're getting some.
In fact, the state has increased our payback for Medicaid specifically up to 75% per employee, for instance. So we're fortunate here for the Medicaid piece. They're realizing there's issues with it. So instead of getting 50% reimbursement, we're now up to 75% reimbursement, which does help us to hire more people in order to hopefully meet their needs.
But it's still only 75%.
Yes, exactly.
So the county has to fund the other 25 of that equation. Plus, we get a portion of computer costs, admin costs, and other things. So, and those are just kind of some of the interesting, the components in the demand for service index. Kind of as you dive deeper into some of these individual pieces, gives you that snapshot of kind of how the county is changing from a demographic perspective. This is the last one, and I haven't spent a ton of time with the sheriff, so I wouldn't even venture to guess as to why this is this way. But I think it's worth noting. Just as you would expect to see, your peak in the 10-11 time frame, and you start to decline as the economy improves. You had a really good year in 2013, but then we had a spike in 2014. And these are on calendar years. This is the one indicator in the demand index that's on a calendar basis. So you see that calls are up about 70, almost 75% if going from here to here. And during that same period of time, the sheriff's increase his FTE by about 17, almost 18%. We haven't really spent any time with the sheriff to figure out why that is. It's kind of a trend that's surprised me, to be honest. But we will probably be asking that in the coming days. So it's just kind of a trend to be aware of as we kind of look at the sheriff's services. He is providing more calls for service than he has historically. And we saw a spike in that in this 2014 year.
And you're thinking that could be a way of reporting, how he's reporting possible.
He didn't indicate that he had changed anything in his report, and we got the same report we always get from him, so I would argue it's probably consistent across time. It's just a matter of, could be a function of him having some additional staff, more calls, response, those kinds of things. I don't put this up here to be as a warning indicator or to say we need to do something. I think it's a trend to understand. This is one of the reasons why your total demand went up, is because you are having more calls for service than you had in the past. We were seeing this trend, and we've expected it to continue down into this area. When it did, and it jumped back up. So anytime we see something out of the ordinary, we kind of scratch our heads and highlight it and try to find out during the budget process kind of what's going on with that specific area. Okay, so what does that all tell us? What does it mean? Demand for services are up by almost 4.4%. We're doing it with 53 fewer FTEs, so that's a positive for the most part, except for those high-risk areas. I think that staffing levels in those high-risk areas should be continue to evaluate those. Because like I said, some things can be achieved with efficiency, but some areas we need to be mindful of the stress and the load we put on those individual FTEs. So overall, after all that, I think the report's about 55 pages long. What can we glean from it? Cost drivers in the general fund, VFDs and EMS. UCPS funding is going to really be an issue because it's not a sustainable model at this point. It's a structural imbalance. We have some concerns about our demand per FTE. And I think these last two are really kind of where we need to be on the long-term planning horizon. Our service delivery model may have to change as we try to balance service need against kind of affordability. You know, kind of back to the discussion, how good a service are you willing to pay for, and at what level do you want to take your tax rate to provide that service? And then also, one of the things we kind of look at in our demand are our fiscal indicators is kind of what our demographics are doing, and what we're seeing is our top end population, 64 and over, is becoming a greater part of our population, and the 18 under population is starting to shrink. That has serious implications when you start talking about the services we provide and the services Richard's department provides. Because as more people age into that population, we have to change the dynamic as far as libraries, parks and recreation, social services, health department, those things. So out on the horizon, what we see is that changing population in Union County. We're getting older, and people are staying in Union County to retire. Now, that's a negative, but it's something we have to be mindful of as we kind of look out on the horizon. And as we go through our long-term planning, because you as a board work at the higher level and the policy level, and we need to kind of keep those things in mind as we look out into the future. So our recommended budget focus areas this year. And the reason we do budget focus areas is, I think, Mr. Rushing, you were on the commission when they used to do green bar paper and we put it on the wall and walk around and mark it up. Well, our process now is we focus on 2 or 3, 4 core key issues and really try to make meaningful, impactful change in those areas while allowing staff to work through the line item detail and kind of ensuring that the rest of the budget meets your expectations. So the 3 areas we've chosen to recommend to you this year, and of course this is up to you as a board, is we want to spend some time talking about the revaluation and the revenue neutral tax rate and how that impacts us and the school's tax rate. So we're proposing that these be work sessions in the future. Sustainable funding for the VFDs, because remember we talked about that being a real issue coming in the long run. And then finally a bond election and other economic development tools that may need election. So the laws have changed such that you can only hold a bond election in even numbered years during general elections. And in 16 you have 3 of those opportunities. You'll have the presidential primary, you'll have the May primary elections, then you'll have the November general election for the presidency and other positions. Then your next opportunity won't be until 2018. And I can almost assure you, as the working group for the school's capital kind of work through their issues, there's a pretty good shot that there's going to be at least some discussion of a bond election as we go through that. So as a commission, what we need to determine is what, A, if you want to take those projects, put them through the bond election, and B, what projects that are in our CIP do we want to either take out of the CIP or put up for bond election. So we're proposing that those be 3 work sessions as we kind of go through March and April and have that discussion. And then again, we anticipate following the same process we did in FY 2015 with the bifurcated process focused on the county and then focusing on the school system and their funding needs. So with that, folks at home, the report will either be up there shortly or should be up there by tomorrow morning for you to read. And I'll open it up to any questions, comments. Everybody's still awake? I did okay on my time.
Good.
Just fine.
So,
Okay, I move that we recess the special meeting to reconvene immediately in the board's conference room, first floor of Union County